The steam and the stink of boiling potatoes clung to Clara like a second skin. It was a damp, heavy heat that never left the saloon kitchen, a place of shadows and scalding water where the noise from the main room bled through the thin plank walls. Shouts and the slam of cards, the out-of-tune plinking of the piano, the raw laughter of men spending their last few pennies on cheap whiskey. It was the soundtrack to her life. At 19, she felt older than the cracked wooden floorboards beneath her bare feet. 2 winters had passed since the fever took her mother and father, leaving her with nothing but a name and a pair of hands good for scrubbing grease and peeling vegetables. Her world had shrunk to this small, hot room. She worked for pennies, and for the grudging permission to sleep on a cot in the back storeroom, a space she shared with sacks of flour and the occasional rat. It was not a life, but it was the only thing keeping her from starving on the sun-baked street of this town, a place called Redemption that had long since forgotten the meaning of its own name. The law in Redemption was a man named Harlan Tate. He wore a silver star on his vest, but it was dull and tarnished, much like the man himself. Sheriff Tate was a big man, with a gut that strained the buttons of his shirt and a face that seemed permanently set in a sneer. He saw the town not as something to protect, but as something to be bled dry. His taxes were a known and feared thing, especially among the women who had no husband or father to speak for them. He called it protection. Protection from what? He never said. But when his shadow fell across your doorway, you paid what he asked. For Clara, the tax was not always in coin. Sometimes it was a portion of her meager food. Other times, it was a long, silent stare that made her feel like she was being stripped bare right there in the dust. He would walk through the kitchen, his boots heavy on the floor, and his eyes would follow her, cold and possessive. He was a patient predator, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her time was running out. Tonight, the saloon was louder than usual. A half-dozen cowboys, fresh off a long cattle drive, were determined to drink away their pay. The air grew thick with sweat and smoke. Brawls broke out and fizzled. Chairs were overturned, and the piano player finally gave up, slinking away into the night. Clara kept her head down, fetching buckets of water and washing tankards until her fingers were raw. She tried to make herself small, invisible, a ghost in the steam. Then a roar of triumph echoed from the main room, followed by a chorus of groans and curses. A man named Jesse, broad-shouldered and with a wild look in his eyes, had won the last pot in a game of poker. He stood up, knocking his chair over, and bellowed, "I won it all, and I want a prize to go with it." Someone laughed. "There ain't nothing left to win, Jesse." Jesse's drunken gaze swept the room. It passed over the painted saloon girls, weary and unimpressed, and then it snagged on the open doorway to the kitchen. He saw Clara, frozen in place, a wet rag clutched in her hand. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "I'll take her," he slurred, pointing a grimy finger. "The kitchen girl, she's mine tonight." The saloon fell quiet for a heartbeat. In that silence, Clara's world stopped. She could feel every eye in the room on her. Then the laughter started. Louder this time. Crueler. It was a joke to them. She was a joke. Part of the scenery, like a stray dog or a cracked spittoon. Something to be kicked or claimed at will. Her boss, a weary man named Silas, just polished the bar with a rag, his face averted. He would not help. No one would. She looked past the leering faces, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her eyes found Sheriff Harlan Tate, who was leaning against the far wall, a toothpick dangling from his lips. He was watching, his expression one of complete indifference. He was the law. He could have stopped it. A single word from him would have sent Jesse back to his seat, but he said nothing. He simply watched, his cruel eyes faintly amused, as if this were a play put on for his entertainment. In his silence, he gave his permission. Jesse stumbled toward the kitchen, his friends cheering him on. "Come on out, little prize," he grunted, reaching for her. Clara backed away, her body hitting the hot stove. A small cry of pain escaped her lips. She shook her head, her voice a choked whisper. "No, please!" His hand shot out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. He was stronger than he looked, all muscle and cheap whiskey. He started to drag her out of the kitchen, her bare feet slipping on the slick floor. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave of shame that burned hotter than the stove. She was not a person. She was a thing, a prize won in a card game. She struggled, but it was useless. He pulled her into the main room, into the ring of laughing men. Her simple brown dress was stained with grease and potato water. Her hair, which she kept tightly braided, had come loose, falling in a messy tangle around her face. She kept her eyes on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of anyone, least of all the sheriff, whose silent judgment was the worst condemnation of all. "She's a feisty one." Jesse laughed, tightening his grip. Then a voice cut through the noise. It was not loud, but it had the flat, hard quality of a rock striking steel. "Let the girl go." Every head turned. A man had risen from a table in the darkest corner of the saloon. He had been there all evening, nursing a single glass of whiskey, speaking to no one. He was not a big man, not like the sheriff or Jesse, but he was built lean and hard, like a fence post that had weathered 100 storms. Dust covered him from his worn boots to the brim of his hat. His face was all angles and shadows, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held the room. They were pale, the color of a winter sky, and they looked like they had seen things no man should ever see. They looked like they had seen death, and were not impressed by it. Sheriff Tate pushed himself off the wall, his hand drifting casually toward the Colt revolver at his hip. "This ain't your affair, stranger. Mind your own drink." The stranger's eyes did not leave Jesse. "I said, let her go." Jesse, emboldened by the alcohol and his audience, laughed. "Or what? You and what army? Old man." He gave Clara's arm a vicious yank, pulling her in front of him like a shield. The stranger moved. It was not a rush, but a smooth, deliberate glide. One moment he was by his table, the next he was in front of Jesse. He did not reach for a gun. His hand came up, grabbed the front of Jesse's shirt, and twisted. He used the man's own momentum to spin him around, breaking his grip on Clara. She stumbled back, falling against a table. Jesse roared in surprised rage and swung a clumsy, powerful fist. The stranger ducked under it with an ease that spoke of 1,000 fights. His own fist came up in a short, brutal arc. It was not a wild swing, but a precise, economical blow that landed squarely on Jesse's jaw. The sound was like a dry branch snapping. Jesse's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor in a heap, unconscious before he even landed. The saloon was dead silent. The cowboys stared. Their drunken good humor vanished, replaced by a wary respect. The stranger, whose name was Jonah Kane, did not even look at the man he had felled. He turned his gaze to the sheriff. Tate's face was unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his cheek. His hand was now resting fully on the butt of his gun. "You just made a mistake, friend," Tate said, his voice low and menacing. Jonah's expression did not change. "Wasn't my friend you were letting him handle?" He looked over at Clara, who was pushing herself up from the floor, her face pale and streaked with grime. For a moment, their eyes met. He saw the terror in them, but beneath it, something else, a flicker of hard, defiant light. He gave a slight nod, not of kindness, but of acknowledgement. Then he turned, walked back to his table, and placed a few coins down to cover his drink. Without another word, he walked out of the saloon and into the night. The spell was broken. Men started muttering, dragging Jesse's limp body toward the door. Clara stood up, pulling her torn dress together. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her again, but the looks were different now. Some held pity, Some held a new, calculating interest. The stranger had marked her, just as surely as Jessie had. She turned and walked back into the kitchen, her back straight, her head held high. She did not look at the sheriff. She did not look at anyone. Inside, she was shaking so hard she thought her bones would rattle apart. The tears burned behind her eyes, hot and bitter, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry. Not here, not for them. And she did not thank the stranger. She did not even know his name. Gratitude was a debt, and she was tired of owing men. She had learned long ago, in the harshest of ways, that any kindness from a man in this world came with a price tag attached. He had saved her from Jessie, but who would save her from him, or from the sheriff, whose anger he had so clearly earned? No, she owed no one. She would survive on her own, or not at all. Outside of town, where the last flickering lights of redemption gave way to an ocean of darkness, Jonah Kane made his camp. It was not much of a camp. He did not build a fire, not wanting to draw attention. He unsaddled his horse, a tough, weary gelding, and gave it the last of his water. He sat with his back against his saddle, the cold desert air seeping into his bones. The silence of the plains should have been a comfort, but tonight it was filled with ghosts. He closed his eyes and saw the girl's face, the fear, the defiance. It reminded him of another face, another girl, from years ago. A woman's voice whispered in his memory, a faint, desperate cry he had been too late to answer, a promise he had failed to keep. That failure was a brand on his soul, a constant, aching weight that had driven him from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. He had been passing through redemption, same as any other dusty, forgotten town. He had not meant to get involved, but when he saw the sheriff's cold indifference, saw the girl's silent plea for a dignity that no one was willing to grant her, something inside him had broken. He had acted without thinking, a reflex born of old regrets. Now, he had drawn the eye of the law in a town run by a crooked man. He knew he should ride on, put 100 miles between himself and that place by sunrise. But the image of the girl's eyes stayed with him, a silent question he could not answer. He looked out at the land around him. It was a harsh, unforgiving country. The moonlight washed the color from everything, leaving a world of silver and black, endless stretches of dry brush and pale, sandy soil, dotted with the skeletal shapes of yucca and cholla cactus. Rattlers hunted in the cool of the night, their movements a dry whisper in the sand. Somewhere in the distant hills, the howl of a wolf echoed, a thin, hungry sound that spoke of starvation. The river that had once carved a path through this valley was long gone, its bed a pale, winding scar of cracked mud and bleached stones. It was a land that promised nothing and took everything, a place where only the hard and the mean survived, a place where softness could get you killed. He lay back, pulling his hat over his eyes. But sleep would not come. He was just a man passing through. That is what he told himself. By morning, he would be gone. But morning came, and Jonah found he was not gone. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in brutal shades of orange and red, and he found himself riding back toward town. His canteen was empty and his supplies were low. That was the reason he gave himself. A man needed water, beans, and coffee. It was a practical matter, nothing more. He ignored the other, deeper reason, the one that felt like a hook lodged deep in his gut. The town looked even more pathetic in the clean morning light. A single dusty street, lined with false-fronted buildings that were peeling and warped from the sun. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, his eyes scanning the street. It was quiet. A few people were out, sweeping their porches or heading to work, but they scurried past him, their eyes averted. News traveled fast in a town this small. He was a marked man. He bought his supplies, paying the storekeeper with a few worn coins. The man's hands trembled slightly as he counted the change. Jonah packed the goods into his saddlebags, his movements unhurried. He was about to swing himself up onto his horse, to finally ride away and leave this place to its own misery, when he saw her. Clara was walking out of the sheriff's office. She moved slowly, stiffly, as if every step was an agony. She was trying to hide it, trying to walk with her back straight, but he could see the slight, almost imperceptible limp in her right leg. Her face was scrubbed clean, but it was as pale as bleached bone, and there was a dark, purplish bruise forming just below her jawline, partially hidden by her collar. She clutched a small bundle in her arms, her knuckles white. She did not see him at first. Her eyes were fixed on the ground in front of her, as if she were afraid to look up, afraid of what she might see in the faces of the people she passed. But then, as she drew level with him, she must have sensed his presence. She stopped and slowly lifted her head. Their eyes met across the dusty street. He did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. The sheriff's office, the limp, the bruise hidden like a guilty secret, it all told a story as old and as ugly as the land they stood on. The sheriff's tax had been collected. She did not tell him anything. Her face was a mask of tightly controlled pain. Her eyes held no plea for help, no accusation, nothing at all but a deep, hollow emptiness. She looked at him for a long, silent moment, a moment that stretched into an eternity. In her silence, he heard everything. He heard the humiliation, the pain, the crushing weight of a world that had offered her nothing but cruelty. And in that silence, she seemed to hear him, too. An understanding passed between them, a shared recognition of the world's ugliness. It was not a bond of sympathy or pity, but something harder, something forged in the simple, unspoken truth of their separate, aching wounds. Then, she broke the gaze. She lowered her head, pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and continued on her way, her limp a silent testament to the price of survival in redemption. Jonah Kane stood by his horse, his hand resting on the saddle horn. He watched her until she disappeared into the alleyway beside the saloon. He should have mounted up. He should have ridden west and never looked back. But he did not. He just stood there, the hot sun beating down on his neck, while a cold, familiar anger began to smolder deep within his chest. He was just a man passing through, but he had a feeling he was not passing through anymore. Clara returned to the saloon kitchen the next day. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, protesting soreness. The bruise on her jaw was a dull, throbbing map of shame that she tried to hide by keeping her head tilted down, her hair falling across her cheek. The work was a misery. Lifting the heavy iron pots of water sent jolts of fire through her back, and the steam from the boiling laundry felt like it was trying to suffocate her. But she worked without a word of complaint. To complain was to show weakness, and weakness was a death sentence in a place like Redemption. The other girls in the saloon, the ones who painted their faces and sold their laughter for coin, watched her from the doorway. Some looked away quickly, a flicker of fear in their eyes. Others stared with a cold, assessing pity, as if she were a horse that had been ridden too hard and was now fit only for the knacker's yard. They knew what the sheriff's attention meant. They had seen it before. Late in the afternoon, Maeve, the madam who ran the saloon with a will of iron and a heart of flint, came into the kitchen. She was a woman whose own youth had been ground into dust by men like Harlan Tate, and what was left was hard and practical. She did not offer sympathy. Sympathy was a luxury. "You pull yourself together, girl," she said, her voice low and raspy from too much whiskey and too many years of shouting over the piano. She looked at the bruise on Clara's face, her expression unreadable. "You keep your head down and your mouth shut. You do what he tells you. Once the sheriff's marked a girl, she either learns to be useful to him or she disappears. There ain't no in between." Maeve's eyes, tired and ancient, held Clara's for a moment. "You understand me. You don't fight. You don't run. You just survive." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The words were not cruel. They were a terrible kind of truth. They were a pronouncement of her fate, delivered by someone who had already lived it. A few miles outside of town, where the dust and noise gave way to a vast, aching silence. Jonah Kane was mending a fence. He had been approached that morning by an old rancher named Elias Vance, a man with skin like wrinkled leather and hands gnarled into claws by a lifetime of hard work. Elias needed a hand with his fences, which were in a sorry state of disrepair. The pay was next to nothing, but it came with a place to sleep in the barn and a share of the food. Jonah had agreed immediately. He did not want the company. He wanted the quiet. He wanted the mindless, punishing labor of digging post holes and stretching wire until his muscles burned and his mind was too tired to think. He worked from sunup to sundown under the brutal western sky, his only companions the wind and the buzzards circling high overhead. He was trying to sweat the memory of redemption out of his system. He was trying to forget the sight of a girl with haunted eyes limping away from the sheriff's office. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. The fence was a barrier, a line he was drawing between himself and the town. But he knew, with a grim certainty, that some things could not be fenced out. The rumors started as a whisper. A foul little secret passed between washerwomen and behind the hands of men drinking at the bar. But soon, the whisper grew into a common understanding, a fact of life in redemption. The sheriff had claimed the kitchen girl. It was said that he was having a room prepared for her in his own house, the small, tidy, clapboard building that stood beside the jail. She would no longer be just a saloon drudge. She would be his property, in full view of everyone. Clara felt the rumors in the way people looked at her. The women of the town now pulled their children away when she passed, as if she carried a disease. The men looked at her with a new kind of hunger, a sly, knowing glance that stripped her bare. She belonged to the sheriff, and that made her a forbidden, tainted thing. She was more alone than she had ever been, an outcast in a town of outcasts. Yet, in the midst of her own quiet despair, something in her refused to break. She saw the hollow cheeks and wide, hungry eyes of the Baker children, whose father had died in a mining accident, and the ragged clothes of the widow Miller's 2 little girls. She saw their hunger, and it mirrored the emptiness inside her own soul. So she began to steal. It was not much, a handful of potatoes here, a day-old loaf of bread there, a few scraps of leftover meat wrapped in a cloth. Late at night, when the saloon was quiet and the town was asleep, she would slip out of the storeroom and creep through the dark alleyways, a small, furtive shadow. She would leave the little bundles of food on the doorsteps of the needy, a silent offering to a world that had offered her nothing but pain. It was a dangerous game. If Silas, her boss, caught her, she would be thrown out onto the street. If Sheriff Tate found out, the punishment would be far worse. He did not tolerate charity. He believed that hunger kept people compliant, but Clara did it anyway. This small, secret act of rebellion was the only thing that was truly hers. It was the only way she could prove to herself that Harlan Tate did not own her soul. One night, Jonah rode into town for a pouch of tobacco. He avoided the saloon, but as he was passing the alleyway behind it, he heard a sound, a soft, choked sob. Quickly stifled, he stopped, his hand resting on the neck of his horse. He dismounted and walked quietly to the edge of the alley. There, in the pale moonlight, he saw her. Clara was leaning against the rough wooden wall of the saloon, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. It was a moment of pure, unguarded grief, a breaking point she had held back for days. Jonah watched, hidden in the shadows, feeling like an intruder on a sacred sorrow. He felt an urge to go to her, to say something. But what could he say? Words were useless against this kind of pain. He watched as she cried for a full minute, her body trembling. Then, he saw something remarkable. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and another. She slowly lifted her head from her hands and wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and smoothed the front of her worn dress. It was a transformation. The broken, weeping girl vanished, and in her place stood a woman made of steel and sorrow. She took one more breath, turned, and walked back into the saloon as if she had not a care in the world. Jonah remained in the shadows long after she was gone. He had seen her at her weakest, but he had also seen the incredible, stubborn strength that lay beneath. He had seen women cry before, but he had never seen one put herself back together with such fierce, quiet determination. A few days later, a strange curiosity led him to follow her. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the saloon was closed. He saw her leave, carrying a small, wilting bouquet of wildflowers she must have gathered from the dry patch of land behind the building. He stayed back, keeping her in sight as she walked through the town and out the other side, toward the low hills where the original settlement had stood. She went to the ruins of an old church. The roof had long since collapsed, and the walls were nothing more than crumbling adobe skeletons, but a single, unadorned wooden cross still stood, leaning against the blue sky. Clara knelt before a small, unmarked mound of stones just outside the church walls. She gently placed the wildflowers on the mound, her fingers lingering on the stones. She did not pray. She just knelt there, silent and still, a solitary figure in a vast, empty landscape. Jonah dismounted and walked toward her, his boots making soft sounds in the dust. He did not try to hide his approach. She heard him and looked up, her hand instinctively flying to her chest. There was no fear in her eyes, just a deep, weary surprise. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hat in his hands. "Sorry to disturb you," he said. His voice sounded rough and unused. She shook her head. "You are not disturbing anything." She looked back at the pile of stones. "My mother, she's buried here." They stood in silence for a long time. The only sound was the wind whispering through the ruins. "I saw you the other night," Jonah said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "behind the saloon." Clara's jaw tightened. She kept her gaze on the grave. "A woman has a right to her tears." "I was not judging," he said. "I was admiring." She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the trick, the hidden price. Admiring what? A stray dog that has been kicked one too many times? A bitter, broken sound that might have been a laugh escaped her lips. "Do not look at me like that. With pity in your eyes. I am not a woman anymore. Just something to be used." Her words hung in the air, raw and painful. Jonah looked at her, at the proud, defiant set of her shoulders, at the deep, ancient pain in her young eyes. He saw the bruises, both the ones on her skin and the ones on her soul. "Then they're blind," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not you broken." Clara stared at him, her mouth slightly parted. For the first time, she did not know what to say. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked past the dirt and the shame to see the person underneath. She saw no pity in his eyes. She saw something else, something she could not name, a shared understanding, a reflection of her own pain. She quickly looked away, unnerved by the sudden, unexpected feeling. She stood up, brushing the dust from her dress. "I have to get back," she said, her voice strained. She walked past him without another word, hurrying back toward the town, back toward her prison. That night, the air grew thick and heavy, promising a storm that would never come. Clara lay on her cot in the storeroom, listening to the sounds of the saloon finally dying down. She knew he would come tonight. Sheriff Tate, he had a way of showing up on the quietest nights, when he knew she would be alone and exhausted. The dread was a cold knot in her stomach. She heard the saloon's back door creak open and then close. Heavy footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. She closed her eyes, preparing herself for the inevitable. The footsteps stopped outside her door. She braced herself. But the door did not open. Instead, she heard a low voice from the other side, Sheriff Tate's voice, tight with anger. "What in the hell do you think you are doing, Kane?" There was a silence. Then Jonah's voice, calm and even. "Just sitting." Clara sat bolt upright on her cot, her eyes wide. She crept to the door and pressed her ear against the rough wood. "You get out of my way," Tate snarled. "This is official town business." "Does not look like town business to me," Jonah replied. His voice was still quiet, but it had a dangerous edge now. "Looks like a man about to bother a girl who wants to be left alone." "She is my concern, not yours. You are a drifter. You mean nothing in this town. I could have you in a cell for what you did to Jesse. Or I could have you in a grave for getting in my way right now." The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken violence. Clara held her breath, her hand over her mouth. She could picture them out there in the dark kitchen, the big, arrogant sheriff, his hand on his gun, and Jonah, lean and still, a shadow against the wall. "You might," Jonah said, his voice as flat and final as a tombstone. "But you would be in that grave right beside me." There was another long pause. Clara could hear the sheriff's heavy, angry breathing. Then, the sound of his boots as he turned and stomped out of the kitchen, slamming the back door behind him. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara sank to the floor, her back against the door, her legs too weak to hold her. He was still out there. She could feel his presence through the wood. A steady, unwavering guard. He had not come for her. He had not tried to touch her or speak to her. He had simply placed himself between her and the monster in the dark. She stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of his quiet breathing on the other side of the door, and in that small, dark storeroom, surrounded by the smell of flour and dust. Clara felt a flicker of something she had not felt in years. It was a strange, foreign feeling, so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to even recognize it. It was the feeling of safety. Word of Jonah Kane's defiance spread through Redemption like a fever, in a town built on fear and silence. His quiet stand in the saloon kitchen was like shouting in a church. People spoke of it in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders, wondering what would come next. Sheriff Harlan Tate was not a man who tolerated challenges to his authority, and everyone knew a reckoning was coming. In his office, Sheriff Tate sat behind his desk, a stack of dusty wanted posters before him. The name Jonah Kane had been bothering him, plucking at a string in the back of his memory. He sent a telegraph to the UN, Marshal's office in Prescott, a simple inquiry. While he waited for a reply, he made life in Redemption a living hell. He doubled his taxes on the shopkeepers, arrested a man for spitting on the boardwalk, and made it clear through his sneering deputy, a weasel of a man named Miller, that anyone seen speaking to the new ranch hand out at the Vance place would be noted. The reply from the marshal came 3 days later. As Tate read the crackling paper, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Jonah Kane. It was him, a former gunslinger, part of a gang that had tried to rob a federal payroll wagon 5 years back. The robbery had gone bad. Men were killed on both sides. Kane had been the only one to escape, but his younger brother, Ethan, had not been so lucky. A $5,000 bounty, a handsome sum, more than enough to buy a lot of silence and a lot of loyalty. Tate folded the paper carefully. The drifter was not just an obstacle anymore. He was an opportunity, and Tate knew just the bait to use to spring the trap. Clara felt the town's mood shift. The air grew colder, the stares harder. Her secret acts of kindness had not gone unnoticed, but they were not seen as charity. They were seen as arrogance. The other saloon girls, who had once offered her a sliver of weary camaraderie, now looked at her with open jealousy. Why should the kitchen girl get the attention of both the sheriff and the handsome stranger? A saloon girl named Sadie, whose face was a mask of cheap paint and disappointment, cornered Clara in the lye soap-scented laundry room one afternoon.
"You think you are better than us?"
"Do not you!" Sadie hissed, her voice sharp with resentment. "Hiding your little bruises, sneaking food out the back. You think that man will save you? Men like him, they just break you in a different way." Even the patrons she had once known to be halfway decent turned on her. Men who had previously ignored her now made crude remarks, their eyes lingering on her with a new, ugly possessiveness. She was the sheriff's property, and that seemed to give every man in town the right to look, to speculate, to imagine. Deputy Miller was the worst. He made a point of walking through the kitchen whenever he could, his eyes crawling over her, his smirk promising a violence that was somehow slimier and more personal than the sheriff's. The saloon kitchen, once her only refuge, now felt like a cage filled with spiders. The only place she felt she could breathe was outside of town, so she started walking. In the late afternoons, when her work was done, she would walk the dusty road out to the Vance ranch. She told herself it was just for the fresh air, to escape the suffocating heat of the kitchen. She did not admit, even to herself, that she was walking toward the one person in the world who had ever looked at her and seen something other than a thing to be used. She would help Jonah with his work. She would bring him a bucket of cool water from the well or help him stretch a length of barbed wire, her small hands struggling with the tensioner. They rarely spoke. They worked in a comfortable silence, the rhythms of their labor a language all its own. In these quiet hours, she saw the man behind the fearsome reputation. She saw the gentleness in his hands as he reset a splint on a calf's leg, the weariness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. One sweltering afternoon, she found him lying in the shade of the barn, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His leg was swollen to twice its normal size, and two small, dark puncture marks on his calf told the story. A rattler. He was delirious, muttering a name she did not recognize. "Ethan, I am sorry. Ethan." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Clara's exhaustion. She had seen men die of snakebite. It was a terrible, agonizing death, but she did not run for help. Helping Jonah would be a declaration, an act that would bring the sheriff's full wrath down on them both. Instead, she acted, using a small knife from the tool shed. She cut into the wound, just as her mother had taught her. She sucked the poison out, spitting the foul, bitter liquid into the dust. She tore strips from her own petticoat to make a poultice of mud and herbs, packing it tightly against the wound. For 2 days, she stayed by his side in the barn, sneaking away from the saloon for hours at a time. She dribbled water between his cracked lips and kept the fever sweats from his brow with a cool, damp cloth. In his delirium, he spoke of things she did not understand, of gun smoke and blood on the snow, of a boy's dying gasp. She listened to his broken whispers and held his hand when he thrashed in his sleep, her presence a steady anchor in his fevered storm. When the fever finally broke, he woke to find her asleep in a chair beside him, her head resting on her arms, her face soft and vulnerable in the dim light. He lay there, weak and aching, and watched her, a feeling stirring in his chest that was so foreign and so powerful it frightened him more than any gun or any lawman. Their quiet closeness deepened into something more. A fragile trust began to grow in the space between them. He never asked her about the sheriff. She never asked him about the name Ethan. Their scars were their own, but they no longer felt so alone with them. Then the rain came. It started without warning one afternoon while they were miles from the ranch, trying to round up a few stray cattle that had wandered into a dry canyon. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the wind began to howl, kicking up a blinding wall of dust. Then the heavens opened up. It was not a gentle rain, but a solid, violent curtain of water that turned the dry ground to slick, running mud in minutes. A flash flood. The dry creek bed beside them roared to life, a churning, brown monster of a river filled with debris. They ran, scrambling up the canyon wall, the water rising around their ankles, then their knees. They found shelter under the axle of an old, broken-down wagon that had been abandoned there years ago. its wheels long since rotted away. They huddled together in the small space, the world outside a roaring chaos of wind and water. The rain hammered on the warped wooden planks above them, the sound deafening. They were soaked to the skin, their clothes heavy and cold. Clara began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable shaking that rattled her whole body. Jonah pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her, trying to shield her with his own body. He was shivering too. They clung to each other, not out of passion, but out of a desperate, primal need for warmth and survival. Her head was tucked under his chin, and she could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her ear. In the midst of the storm's fury, huddled in the dark, muddy space, she felt that strange, forgotten feeling again. Safety. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping. They trudged back to the ranch in the fading light, their boots sinking into the mud with every step. The barn was dry. Elias, the old rancher, had left a lantern burning for them, its golden light a welcoming beacon. Inside, Jonah built a small fire in the forge. He found a couple of old horse blankets and handed one to Clara. "Get out of those wet things," he said, his back to her as he tended the flames. She stood there, shivering, her wet dress clinging to her like a second skin. He was not looking at her, but she felt as if she were completely exposed. This man had seen her cry. He had stood guard over her. He had let her tend to him in his weakness, and he had held her through a storm. He had seen more of her true self than anyone. Slowly, deliberately, she began to unbutton the front of her dress. The wet fabric peeled away from her skin. She let it fall to the dirt floor. She stood before him in her thin, patched chemise. The firelight flickered across her skin, painting her in shadows and gold. "Jonah," she whispered. He turned. His eyes widened slightly as he took her in, but his gaze did not hold the hunger or the cruelty she was used to. It held something else, something soft, something that hurt to look at. With trembling fingers, she pushed the strap of her chemise off her shoulder. Then the other, she lowered the garment to her waist, baring her torso to the warm, flickering light. She was not trying to entice him. This was not a seduction. It was a confession. The firelight revealed the map of her suffering, the pale, faded lines of old scars on her back from a time she no longer spoke of, the yellow and purple mottling of newer bruises on her ribs and along her side. Small, ugly blossoms of pain left by Sheriff Tate. She stood before him, vulnerable and silent, showing him the truth of her life, the physical record of what it meant to be something to be used. She was showing him the part of herself she had never let anyone see. Jonah looked, and his face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a terrible, silent rage. He took a step toward her, and she flinched, instinctively bracing herself, but he did not touch her. He did not touch a single bruise. He reached for the dry coat hanging on a peg, Elias Vance's old woolen coat, and gently, reverently, wrapped it around her shoulders. He pulled it closed, hiding the scars and the bruises from the firelight, from his own eyes. He looked down at her, his throat working. "You do not owe me a damn thing," he said, his voice thick and raw. That was what finally broke her. The tears came, silent and hot, streaming down her cheeks. She did not sob or make a sound. She just cried, her shoulders shaking beneath the heavy coat. It was not a cry of fear or of pain. It was a cry of profound, earth-shattering relief. He had seen the very worst of her, the broken, bruised parts she kept hidden from the world, and he had not recoiled in disgust. He had not taken what she offered. He had covered her. He had protected her, because he didn't ask for anything. The next morning, Clara woke in the hayloft, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets. Jonah was gone. She panicked for a moment, a cold fear gripping her heart. But then she saw him. He was standing near the edge of the property, by a lone, weathered wooden cross that marked the grave of some forgotten soul. He had a shovel in his hands. She watched as he dug into the hard, damp earth beside the grave marker. He worked with a grim, steady purpose. After a few minutes, his shovel struck something solid. He knelt and pulled a long, oilcloth-wrapped bundle from the hole. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a Colt Peacemaker, its wooden grip worn smooth, its steel barrel dark and menacing. It was not a rancher's gun. It was a gunslinger's gun. He checked the action, his movements practiced and sure. He slid it into the leather holster of a gun belt that had also been in the bundle and strapped it low on his hip. It changed him. The quiet, weary ranch hand disappeared, and in his place stood Jonah Kane, the man from the wanted posters, a man who knew death intimately. Clara walked slowly toward him, her heart pounding. The gun on his hip was a statement, a finality. "Are you leaving?" she whispered, the question tasting like ash in her mouth. He turned to face her. His eyes were clear and hard. All the weariness burned away, replaced by a cold, steady fire. "Not if I can help it," he replied, his voice low and certain. "But this town's about to burn." The gun on Jonah's hip changed the air around him. It was a cold, heavy presence that spoke a language the town of Redemption understood far better than words. Sheriff Harlan Tate understood it. He saw Jonah ride into town for supplies, the worn holster tied down against his thigh, and the sheriff's usual sneer was replaced by a look of narrow, calculating assessment. The bounty was a sure thing, but a man like Kane was not one to be taken easily. He would need to be cornered, trapped, and for that, Tate needed the town on his side. He started by spreading poison. His deputy, Miller, moved through the saloon and the general store like a foul wind, whispering stories. He said Kane was a wanted man, a killer who had come to Redemption to hide. He said the man had bewitched the kitchen girl, Clara, filling her head with lies and turning her against the town's lawful authority. He painted Jonah as a serpent in their midst, and Clara as a fallen woman, a fool who had chosen a murdering drifter over the sheriff's protection. 2 days after Jonah strapped on his gun, Sheriff Tate called a town meeting. He stood on the steps of the saloon, his voice booming across the dusty street. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. People gathered, drawn by a mixture of fear and a grim, morbid curiosity. They stood in a loose semicircle, their faces tight and wary. Elias Vance stood at the back of the crowd, his old face set in grim lines, watching. When the crowd was thick enough, Deputy Miller emerged from the jailhouse, dragging Clara by the arm. She stumbled, her face pale, but her head was held high. A murmur went through the crowd. They had all heard the rumors, and now, here was the proof. Tate held up a hand for silence. "People of Redemption," he began, his voice oozing a false sincerity. "I have called you here today on a matter of safety. Our safety. A wolf has entered our flock. A man calling himself Jonah Kane." He pointed a thick finger toward the Vance ranch, miles away. "This man is a fugitive from the law, a thief and a murderer with a $5,000 bounty on his head." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. $5,000 was a fortune, a king's ransom. "He came here to hide, to prey on our good nature," Tate continued, his voice rising with righteous fury. "And he has sunk his claws into one of our own." He gestured dramatically at Clara. "This poor, misguided girl. He has twisted her mind, used her innocence against her. I have it on good authority that he has been threatening her, forcing her to aid him, holding her in his thrall." He turned to Clara, his eyes boring into her. His voice dropped to a low, menacing tone that only she could hear. "Tell them, girl, tell them how he came to you, how he threatened you if you did not do as he said. Tell them he is a violent man. Your name is already on the witness statement. All you have to do is say the words." Clara looked out at the faces in the crowd. She saw judgment, pity, and cold indifference. She saw Sadie, the saloon girl, smirking in satisfaction. She saw the women who pulled their children away from her. Not one of them met her eyes. They were all waiting for her to play her part in the sheriff's theater. Her gaze swept the crowd, searching for one face she knew she would not find. Jonah. He was at the ranch, unaware. She was alone. She looked at Harlan Tate, at his smug, cruel face. She thought of the long nights listening for his footsteps, of the bruises she hid, of the small, secret kindnesses that had been her only rebellion. She thought of Jonah, a man who had looked at her brokenness and had not turned away, a man who had asked for nothing. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was as clear and steady as a church bell on a cold morning. No. The word was a stone dropped into a silent pond. Tate's smile faltered. What did you say, girl? I said no, Clara repeated, looking him directly in the eye. He did not threaten me. He has never been anything but decent to me. Tate's face darkened, the blood rising in his cheeks. You will say what I tell you to say, he hissed, grabbing her arm. No, she said again, her chin lifting in defiance. You are the one who threatens. You are the one who hurts people. He is a better man than you will ever be. The sheriff's rage finally broke its leash. He backhanded her across the face, the crack of the blow echoing in the sudden, shocked silence of the street. Clara staggered, a bright red mark blooming on her cheek, but she did not cry out. She simply stared back at him, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. Foolish girl, Tate snarled, his public performance forgotten, his true nature revealed. You have made your choice. He shoved her toward his deputy. Throw her in the cellar. Let her sit in the dark and think about what happens to liars in my town. As Miller dragged her away, the crowd parted, silent and afraid. No one intervened. Elias Vance watched her go, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like ropes. He turned and walked away, his movements stiff with an old man's fury. The news reached the ranch an hour later, carried by a young boy Elias had paid to keep watch. Jonah was cleaning his revolver when the boy rode up, breathless, as he listened to the story of the meeting, of Clara's defiance and her punishment. A terrible stillness came over Jonah. The rage that rose in him was not hot and explosive, but cold and silent, a glacier of lethal intent. He set the gun down, his movements precise, and his face was like a mask carved from stone. Elias came out of the small ranch house, a shotgun cradled in his arms. He looked at Jonah's face and nodded slowly. I figured it would come to this, the old man said, his voice a low rumble. Harlan Tate has been poisoning this town for years. Jonah looked at him, his pale eyes glittering with a cold fire. I am going to get her out. Not alone, you are not, Elias said. He squinted at Jonah, his gaze searching. You have your father's eyes, but not his temper. Thank the Lord, I knew him. You know, Samuel Kane. We rode together for a spell, a long time ago. He was a hard man, but he was a just one. What they said about him after that payroll job, it was all lies. Jonah's expression did not change, but something flickered deep in his eyes. He had not heard his father's name spoken with respect in many years. He would not have left that girl in there. Elias finished, and neither will we. They planned quickly, their words clipped and efficient. Elias would ride to the far side of town and cause a distraction. Jonah would go in for Clara. There was no time to waste. Tate would not leave her in that cellar forever. Meanwhile, a new shadow had fallen over redemption. Jesse, the cowboy Jonah had knocked unconscious, had returned. He had spent 2 weeks in the next county, drinking and brooding, the humiliation of that night festering in him like a sickness. A jagged scar now ran through his eyebrow where his head had hit a table, a constant, physical reminder of his shame. He was drunker than ever, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and he was consumed by a single, obsessive thought. Clara. in his warped mind. She was still his prize, something he had won and that had been stolen from him. He staggered into the saloon and heard the news. The girl was in the jailhouse cellar. His girl. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. He found Deputy Miller at the bar, nursing a whiskey. Jesse slapped a heavy hand on the man's shoulder. "I want to see her," Jesse slurred, his breath foul. Miller shook his head. "Sheriff's orders. No one goes in." Jesse leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The sheriff wants her scared, does not he? Wants her to learn a lesson. Maybe I could help teach her, remind her who she belongs to." He slid a few silver dollars across the bar. Miller looked at the coins, then at Jesse's crazed eyes. The deputy had his own resentments against Clara, against the stranger who had made him look like a fool. A little fear, a little rough handling. It would serve her right. He palmed the coins. "The door at the back of the building is not locked. The cellar key is on the hook just inside. Be quick about it." And quiet. The cellar was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and mildew. A small, pot-bellied stove in the corner provided a meager warmth and the only light, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Clara sat on a pile of old burlap sacks, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying not to think about the spiders she had seen scuttling into the cracks. She heard the scrape of a key in the lock. Her head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. She expected the sheriff, but the man who filled the doorway was bigger, broader, and his silhouette was horribly familiar. "Jesse." "Hello, little prize," he grunted, closing and locking the door behind him. The scar on his face was a livid white line in the dim light. "Looks like we finally get to be alone." Clara scrambled to her feet, backing away until she hit the cold stone wall. "What do you want?" "What I won," he said, taking a step toward her. Tate can have you after I am done. I just want to collect my winnings." A primal fear, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. But beneath it was the defiance she had shown in the street. She would not be a victim. Not again. Her eyes darted around the small room, searching for a weapon. Her gaze fell on the stove. Beside it, on the floor, was a pair of heavy, iron fire tongs. As he lunged for her, she dove to the side, snatching them up. They were heavy and awkward in her hands, but they were solid. She held them in front of her like a sword. "Stay away from me," she said, her voice shaking but firm. He laughed, a low, guttural sound. "A little fire poker? You think that will stop me?" He came at her again, and she swung the tongs with all her might. The heavy iron struck his shoulder, and he grunted in pain, surprised by her strength. His surprise turned to rage. He charged her, grabbing the front of her dress and slamming her back against the wall. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and stars exploded behind her eyes. His foul, whiskey-soaked breath was hot on her face. She struggled, kicking and scratching, but he was too strong. His hand tangled in her hair, yanking her head back. With her free hand, she still clung desperately to the tongs. As he forced her to the ground, she swung the tongs upward in a wild, desperate arc. The pointed ends caught him just below the eye, tearing a deep, bloody gash down his cheek. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and staggered back, clutching his face. Blood poured through his fingers. The fight was not over. He was wounded, but the pain had made him a feral animal. He kicked out, catching her in the ribs, and she cried out as a sharp pain shot through her side. He knocked over the stove in his rage, sending a shower of hot coals and smoke across the floor. Suddenly, a gunshot blasted through the cellar, deafeningly loud. The lock on the door exploded in a shower of splinters. The door was kicked open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the night sky. Jonah. He took in the scene in a single, frozen moment. The smoking, overturned stove, Jesse clutching his bleeding face, and Clara on the floor. bruised and gasping for breath but holding the bloody tongs like a cornered wolverine. He did not hesitate. He moved past Jessie as if he were not there, his focus entirely on her. He knelt and gently took the tongs from her hands, his touch infinitely gentle. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms. She collapsed against him, all the fight draining out of her, replaced by a storm of shuddering sobs. She buried her face in his chest, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tilted off its axis. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, whispering her name. Smoke began to fill the small room from the smoldering coals. They had to leave. He pulled her toward the door. As they stepped out into the cool night air, she looked up at his face, her eyes swimming with tears. "Why?" she sobbed, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Why did you come back?" He held her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. He looked into her eyes, and his own were filled with an emotion so fierce and so tender it stole her breath. "Because you said nothing," he whispered, his voice rough with feeling. "That morning on the street, you said nothing at all, and I have never heard silence speak so loud." He kissed her then, a brief, desperate press of his lips to hers, a seal on a promise he had made to himself without even realizing it. They had no time. Shouts were already rising from the far end of town as Elias's distraction took hold. 2 horses, saddled and ready, waited in the shadows behind the jail. He lifted her onto one and swung up onto the other. Without a backward glance, they spurred the horses into a gallop, leaving the lights and the cruelty of redemption behind them, and fled into the vast, dark wilderness. They rode for hours, pushing the horses hard, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the town that had tried to swallow them whole. They rode through a landscape of ghosts, the moonlight carving jagged shapes from the rock and casting long, skeletal shadows from the saguaro. It was a dry, thirsty land of jagged cliffs and deep, winding canyons where a wrong turn could lead to a dead end and a slow death. There was no water, no sign of life, only the endless expanse of rock and sand and a sky so full of stars it seemed to be spilling over. Finally, when the horses were lathered and trembling with exhaustion, they found a small alcove, a shallow cave carved into a cliff face by a million years of wind. It offered a sliver of shelter from the night. Jonah helped Clara down from her horse. Her body was a symphony of aches, her ribs screaming with every breath. But she was alive. They were alive, and they were together. They did not speak. Words were not needed. He built a small, smokeless fire from dry scrub brush. They shared a canteen of water and a piece of hardtack from his saddlebags. They sat side by side, watching the flames dance, their shoulders barely touching. The silence of the desert surrounded them, a vast, peaceful emptiness that was the opposite of the suffocating silence of town. When the fire had burned down to embers, he laid out a bedroll for her. She lay down, and he sat beside her, his back against the rock, his revolver across his lap, keeping watch. She looked up at him, at his hard, beautiful profile outlined against the star-dusted sky. He had come back for her. He had walked into the fire for her. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, and they wrapped around hers. He looked down at her, and in the soft, gray light of the stars, the walls they had both built around their hearts finally crumbled to dust. He lay down beside her, pulling her close. Their love finally broke free, not in a rush of desperate passion, but in a slow, quiet unfolding beneath the vast, silent witness of the desert sky. It was a communion of scars, a gentle mapping of each other's pain. His touch was not a demand, but a question, a reverence. Her response was not a submission, but a gift, a sharing of the self she had fought so hard to keep from being stolen. It was slow and raw, full of quiet grief and a tenderness that was more profound than any spoken promise. In the heart of that unforgiving wilderness, they found a small, fragile sanctuary in each other's arms, a shared breath against the encroaching darkness. Back in Redemption, the morning sun did little to burn away the ugliness of the previous day. Harlan Tate stood on the steps of his office, his authority re-established not by law, but by a public display of brute force. The town was cowed, silent. He had made his point. Now, he would make his profit. He pinned a new, crudely lettered notice to the board outside his office. It declared Jonah Kane a wanted outlaw, a fugitive from federal justice, with a $5,000 bounty on his head. Beside it, he pinned another notice, this one for Clara. It did not offer a bounty. It simply described her as a runaway harlot and an accomplice to a known felon, to be returned to the custody of the sheriff for her own protection and moral correction. The words were a brand, a public declaration that she was not a person but a stray animal to be captured and caged. Greed, a far more potent motivator than justice, began to stir in the town's gut. $5,000. Men who had spent their lives breaking their backs for a few dollars a day looked at each other with new eyes. They looked at their dusty, holstered pistols and saw a path to a different life. Revenge was a powerful spice in the stew as well. Clara's defiance had been an insult to the natural order of things, and the men of Redemption were eager to see her put back in her place. A posse formed before noon. It was not an orderly group of concerned citizens. It was a rabble of barflies, failed prospectors, and resentful cowboys, all led by the sneering Deputy Miller. Jesse, his face a swollen, stitched-up mess where Clara's fire tongs had torn him open, was among the first to volunteer. His desire for the bounty was secondary to his burning need to reclaim what he saw as his property and punish the girl who had scarred him. They rode out of town in a cloud of dust and cheap whiskey, a pack of wolves eager for the hunt. But the wilderness was vast, and Jonah Kane was a ghost. They found the tracks of 2 horses leading into the Badlands, but the trail was soon lost in the hard, rocky ground. For 2 days, they scoured the canyons, their enthusiasm waning under the relentless sun as their canteens ran dry. Frustrated and angry, they turned their sights on an easier target. They knew the old rancher. Elias Vance had given Kane shelter. He was an accomplice. On the 3rd morning, the posse descended on his small, quiet ranch. Elias met them on his porch, his old shotgun held loosely in his hands. He was one man against a dozen. He did not stand a chance. They beat him until he could no longer stand, his old bones protesting with sickening cracks. They left him lying in the dirt beside his own well, his face a bloody ruin. Then, with a casual cruelty, they set a torch to his barn. The dry ancient timber went up with a roar, the flames licking at the pale blue sky. They rode away laughing, leaving the old man to watch his life's work turn to ash and smoke, a stark and brutal message to anyone else in Redemption who might consider defying the sheriff. Miles away, hidden deep in the labyrinthine canyons, Clara and Jonah saw the smoke. It was a thick black pillar rising against the horizon, a funeral pyre in the distance. They both knew, with a sickening certainty, what it was.
"Elias,"
Clara whispered, her voice choked. The name was a prayer and a curse. Jonah's face was grim, his jaw set like granite. He said nothing, but a muscle twitched in his cheek. He had brought this down on the old man. His past had finally caught up, and it was burning down the lives of anyone who showed him a moment of kindness. That night, as Jonah slept a light, troubled sleep, Clara lay awake, staring at the cold, indifferent stars. The smoke from the ranch was gone, but she could still see it branded on the inside of her eyelids. She saw Elias's kind, wrinkled face. She saw the quiet life he had built, now destroyed, because of her. Because she had allowed this dangerous, wanted man into her life. Sadie's words came back to her, sharp and venomous. Men like him, they just break you in a different way. But it was not Jonah who was breaking things. It was her. She was the poison. Everything she touched, she ruined. Her parents had died, leaving her alone, The town had turned on her, and now Elias, a good and decent man, had paid the price for her defiance. She looked at Jonah, at the weary lines etched around his eyes even in sleep. How long before her poison destroyed him? Too. She loved him. The realization was a sharp, painful ache in her chest. She loved him enough to know she had to leave him, to save him from herself. Before the first hint of dawn, she slipped out of her bedroll. Her movements were silent, practiced from a lifetime of trying to be invisible. She took one of the horses, a canteen of water, and a small portion of their dwindling food supply. She did not allow herself a backward glance. If she looked at him, she would not be able to go. She rode away, a lone, small figure moving through the pre-dawn gloom, tears freezing on her cheeks. She did not get far. An hour later, as the sun began to cast long, ghostly shadows across the desert floor, she heard the sound of another horse behind her. Her heart sank. It was Jonah. He rode up beside her, his face not angry, but filled with a deep, aching sadness. "Where are you going, Clara?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Away," she said, not looking at him. "You should have let me go. I cannot do that." "You have to," she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "Do you not see? I am a curse. I bring ruin to everyone I meet. My family, Elias, you. The sheriff will not stop until he has us. He will kill you because of me." "He will kill me because of who I am." Jonah corrected her gently. "This is not your fault." "It is," she insisted, finally turning to face him, her eyes wild with grief and self-loathing. "I am poison. Jonah, stay away from me. Go. Ride the other way. Save yourself." He reached out and took the reins of her horse, bringing them both to a stop. He dismounted and stood before her, looking up at her, his expression raw and open. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I have spent the last 5 years running from my past, running from myself. I am not running anymore. And I am not running from you." He reached up and gently touched her cheek. "You are not poison. Clara, you are the first good, clean thing I have found in this whole rotten world. Do not let them make you believe you are what they say you are. Please, do not believe it." He was begging her, his eyes pleading with an intensity that shattered her resolve. He was not just trying to save her from the sheriff. He was trying to save her from the prison she had built for herself. She slid from the horse and into his arms, her body shaking with sobs. He held her, his grip strong and sure, a lifeline in the wreckage of her life. They stood there for a long time, two lost souls clinging to each other in the vast, empty wilderness. They traveled on together, moving higher into the mountains, hoping to find a pass that would lead them out of the territory. But the weather turned against them. The sky grew heavy and gray, and a sharp, biting wind swept down from the peaks. What had been a warm autumn day turned into a bitter, premature winter. Then the snow began to fall. At first, it was just a few lazy flakes, but soon it became a thick, blinding curtain of white, a sudden, violent storm that swept in and buried the world. They were lost, cold, and on the verge of collapse when they stumbled upon it. A small, dark shape against the endless white, an old miner's cabin, half buried in a snowdrift, its roof sagging, its chimney a crooked finger of stone pointing at the angry sky. It was a miracle. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp earth and rot, but it was shelter. Jonah managed to get a fire going in the stone hearth with the last of their dried tinder, while Clara brushed the snow from their blankets. The small, one-room cabin was barely furnished, containing only a broken chair, a rickety table, and a narrow cot with a moldy straw mattress. But to them, it was a palace. They huddled by the fire, slowly chasing the deep, dangerous chill from their bones. They were trapped. The storm raged outside, a howling, white fury that showed no signs of stopping. They had a little food, and there was melted snow for water, But they were cut off from the world, in the forced intimacy of the tiny cabin, with the storm sealing them in. The last of their defenses fell away. That night, as they lay together under the thin blankets, Clara began to speak, her voice a near whisper in the dark. "When I was 16, after my parents died, before I went to work at the saloon, I was so alone. There was no food. The winter was so cold." She paused, and Jonah felt her tremble. "I went down to the riverbed. There are these berries that grow there. Nightshade. My mother always warned me they were poison." She took a shaky breath. "I picked a whole handful. They were so dark, like little purple jewels. I sat there for hours, the berries in my hand, just trying to find the courage. I thought it would be better than starving, better than being so completely alone." Jonah held her tighter, his heart aching. He could picture her, a young, grieving girl, holding death in the palm of her hand. "But I could not do it," she whispered, and a single tear traced a hot path down her cold cheek. "Every time I brought my hand to my mouth, I would think of my mother's face. I just could not bring myself to die. I threw the berries in the dirt and went back to town. And the next day, I asked Silas for the job in the kitchen." She broke down then, a quiet, deep weeping for the lost, desperate girl she had been. Jonah held her, rocking her gently, letting her cry it all out. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell her it was all in the past. He just held her, sharing the weight of her memory. When her sobs finally subsided, he kissed the top of her head. "You lived," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara, that is all that matters. That is all you needed to do." They were found on the second day. The storm had lessened, and the world outside was a silent, white expanse. They were cold, hungry, and their fire had burned down to a few glowing embers. Jonah's gun was on the table, where he had been cleaning it. They did not hear him approach, his footsteps muffled by the fresh snow. The cabin door creaked open, and Sheriff Harlan Tate stood there, a long-barreled rifle in his hands. He was alone. His posse had likely given up and gone back to the warmth of the saloon, but Tate's hatred had kept him going. "Well, well," the sheriff said, a triumphant smirk on his face. He looked from Jonah to Clara, huddled by the hearth. "The lovebirds. Looks like your little escape is over." Jonah rose slowly to his feet, placing himself in front of Clara. He was unarmed, his gun a lifetime away on the other side of the room. "This is between you and me. Tate, let her go." Tate laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I do not think so. She is the whole reason I am here, to teach her a lesson about loyalty, and to teach you a lesson about interfering with what is mine." He raised the rifle. The fight was brutal and short. Jonah lunged, not at the gun, but at the man, trying to close the distance. He moved with a desperate speed, but Tate was ready. He sidestepped and swung the heavy rifle like a club, catching Jonah in the ribs. Jonah grunted in pain but did not stop. He crashed into the sheriff, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs, wrestling for the weapon. Clara screamed. She scrambled for Jonah's pistol, but it was too far. The men rolled on the floor, grunting and cursing. Tate was bigger and heavier, and he used his weight to pin Jonah down. He managed to bring the butt of the rifle up, smashing it into Jonah's face. Jonah's head snapped back, and for a moment, he was dazed. It was the opening Tate needed. He pushed Jonah off him, scrambled back a few feet, and brought the rifle to his shoulder. He was aiming not to kill, but to cripple, to make Jonah suffer. The rifle boomed in the small cabin, the sound a physical blow. Jonah cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of agony, and collapsed, clutching his shoulder where a dark, crimson stain was already blossoming on his shirt. Tate stood over him, a look of sadistic pleasure on his face, and began to cock the rifle for another shot. Clara moved. She was not thinking. She was pure, primal instinct, a small skinning knife, left behind by the cabin's long-dead owner, had been lying on the hearth. Her hand closed around its worn wooden handle. She flew across the room, a silent, avenging fury. Tate heard her at the last second and started to turn. He was too late. She drove the knife upward, under his jaw, with all the force of her fear and her rage and her love. The blade sank deep into the soft flesh of his throat. His eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. A gurgling sound escaped his lips. The rifle clattered to the floor. He brought his hands to his throat, trying to stop the impossible, trying to hold his life in. He took one staggering step back, his eyes fixed on her, and then he fell, his big body hitting the floor with a heavy, final thud. The silence that followed was terrifying. Clara stood over him, shaking, the bloody knife still clutched in her hand. Her dress was spattered with his blood. She looked at the dead man on the floor, then at Jonah, who was trying to push himself up, his face white with pain and shock. A terrible, ragged scream tore from her lungs. She dropped the knife as if it had burned her. "He would have killed you," she shrieked, the words a desperate justification, a plea for understanding in the face of the horror she had just committed. "He would have killed you." Jonah crawled to her, his good arm reaching for her. "Clara," he gasped, his voice weak. She fell to her knees beside him, her whole body trembling. Blood was pouring from his shoulder, a terrifyingly bright red against the dirty floor. The storm was still howling outside. She had saved him, but he was bleeding to death in her arms, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She got her arms under him and began to drag him out of the cabin, out of the house of death, and into the cold, cleansing fury of the storm. Jonah woke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee, a scent so gentle and domestic it felt like a dream. The world returned to him in fragments, a roaring blizzard, the deafening blast of a rifle, Clara's scream, and an agony in his shoulder so profound it had blotted out the sun. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus. He was not in the miner's cabin. He was in a small, clean room, lying in a proper bed with a thick quilt pulled up to his chin. Sunlight, pale and thin, streamed through a lace-curtained window. A woman with a kind, weathered face and hair the color of snow looked up from a rocking chair in the corner. "Well now, look who decided to rejoin the living," she said, her voice a soft, comforting rumble. He tried to sit up, but a fresh wave of fire shot through his shoulder, and he fell back with a gasp. "Easy now," the woman said, rising and coming to his side. "You have been sleeping for the better part of 3 days. You lost a lot of blood." "Where?" he managed, his voice a dry rasp. "My name is Martha Penson. My husband passed 2 years back. This is my home, a few miles north of Redemption. I found you both half frozen in the snow. The girl, she was dragging you. I have never seen such a look on a person's face. She would have died out there with you before she let you go." "Clara," the name was an anchor. "Is she?" "She is right here," Martha said, nodding toward the door. "Has not left your side except to help me chop wood or fetch water. Worn to a frazzle. That one is, but she is as stubborn as a mule in a hailstorm." As if summoned, Clara appeared in the doorway, a steaming mug in her hands. She stopped short when she saw his eyes were open. The mug trembled, and a little coffee sloshed over the rim. The exhaustion on her face was so deep it looked like bruises under her eyes, but her expression was one of pure, unadulterated relief. She crossed the room and set the mug on the bedside table, her movements stiff and careful. She looked at him, and in her gaze, he saw the whole terrifying ordeal reflected back at him. "You are awake," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. She reached out, her fingers tentatively touching his good hand, as if to make sure he was real. He wrapped his fingers around hers, his grip weak but certain. He was alive. They were alive. While Jonah healed under Martha's care, word of what had happened in the mountains trickled back to Redemption. A trapper had found Sheriff Tate's body in the abandoned cabin. The story he told was of a brutal fight, of the dead sheriff and the vanished couple. The town was thrown into chaos. For the first time in years, Redemption was a town without a lawman, and the sudden absence of Tate's heavy, oppressive hand left a vacuum that was both liberating and terrifying. A meeting was called in the saloon, the same room where Clara had once been claimed as a prize. The air was thick with speculation and fear. They needed a new sheriff, someone to keep order. It was Jesse who saw his chance. He pushed his way to the front of the room, his scarred face twisted with a righteous fury that was entirely false. He held up his hands for silence. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice slurring slightly from the whiskey he had been drinking for courage. "We have been delivered from a tyrant, but we have been delivered into the hands of something worse, a murderer and his filthy woman." A murmur went through the crowd. "Jonah Kane is a wanted man," Jesse bellowed, pointing a finger at no one in particular. "A back-shooting coward who got what was coming to him. But the real poison in this town is the girl, Clara." He spat her name like a curse. "She bewitched him. She drove him to this. I saw it with my own eyes. She is a temptress, a harlot who uses her body to get what she wants. She laid with the sheriff, and then she laid with the outlaw. Her body is a vessel for sin and trouble, and she brought it all down on our heads." He let his words sink in, preying on their fear, their suspicion, their deep-seated distrust of a woman who did not belong to any one man. "We need a man who understands this town, a man who is not afraid to deal with filth. I will be that man. Make me your sheriff, and I swear I will hunt them down. I will bring that man back in chains, and that woman back to be cleansed of her sins, to serve this town as she should have in the first place." His speech was met with a mixture of uncertain applause and grim silence. He was a brute and a drunk, but he was a known quantity, and he was promising to restore an order they understood. Word of Jesse's bid for power reached Martha Penson's quiet homestead a day later. Jonah was still weak, confined to the bed, and when he heard the news, a helpless rage burned in his eyes. But Clara went very still. She listened to the whole story without a word, her face a pale, unreadable mask. That evening, she packed a small bundle. "What are you doing?" Jonah asked, trying to push himself up. "I am going back," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "No," he said, his voice ragged. "Clara, you cannot. They will tear you apart." She turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw not fear in her eyes, but a clear, cold fire. "Let them try," she said. "I have spent my whole life hiding, letting men like him define me, letting them call me a prize, a harlot, a thing to be used. I am done hiding." She came to his bedside and gently pushed him back down. "You saved me, Jonah. Now I have to save myself." She walked into Redemption the next morning, alone. She wore a simple dress Martha had given her, and her hair was tied back neatly. She was bruised from the fight in the cellar, exhausted from nursing Jonah, and terrified down to her very bones. But she walked with her head held high. People stopped and stared as she made her way down the main street. They saw not a runaway harlot, but a ghost come back to haunt them. She walked directly to the saloon, where the men of the town were gathered to cast their vote. She pushed open the swinging doors and stepped inside. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her. Jesse was standing at the bar, a half-empty bottle in his hand, a look of triumph on his scarred face. When he saw her, his face contorted with a mixture of shock and rage. "What is she doing here?" he snarled. Clara ignored him. She walked to the center of the room and faced the assembly of silent, staring men. She was shaking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she did not back down. "You all know who I am," she began, her voice trembling slightly but carrying to every corner of the room. "I am Clara, the kitchen girl, the girl you watched Jesse try to claim as a prize, The girl you watched the sheriff beat in the street." She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "You have heard stories about me, that I am filth, that I am poison. Jesse tells you I used my body to control men. He is right. I did use my body. I used it to scrub your floors and wash your clothes and peel your potatoes. I used it to survive in a town that would have let me starve. And yes, Sheriff Tate used my body too. He did not ask. He took the same way he took extra taxes from your stores, the same way he took your dignity with his threats. You all knew it. You all saw it. And you all looked the other way." Her voice grew stronger, fueled by the truth she had held inside for so long. "You want to talk about filth? Filth is a man who thinks he can win a woman in a card game. Filth is a lawman who uses his star to hurt the weak. Filth is a town that stays silent while it happens." She turned her burning gaze on Jesse. "You want to be sheriff? You want to protect this town? You could not even protect yourself from a girl with a pair of fire tongs." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Jesse's face turned a mottled purple. "Jonah Kane did not bring trouble here," she finished, her voice ringing with conviction. "He was just the first man who had the decency to stand up to it. He is not the outlaw. The outlaw was Harlan Tate. And if you make this man your sheriff, then you will all be outlaws, too." She stood in the silence that followed, her chest heaving, her entire being laid bare before them. The men looked at her, then at each other, then at the floor. They had seen her as an object for so long. They seemed stunned to discover she had a voice. The swinging doors of the saloon pushed open. Jonah stood there, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch, his arm in a sling. He was pale and gaunt, but his eyes were locked on Clara, filled with a fierce, unwavering pride. He did not speak. He did not have to. He limped slowly across the room, the sound of his crutch thudding on the wooden floor, the only noise in the saloon. He stopped directly behind her, not as a protector coming to her rescue, but as an equal, standing with her. His presence was a silent, powerful affirmation of every word she had spoken. The town hesitated. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. They were on a precipice, a choice between the ugly, familiar past and an uncertain, terrifying future. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It was Elias Vance, his face bruised and swollen, but his eyes clear. Then another person joined him. Then another. The sound grew. A slow, hesitant applause that swelled into a roar of cheers and whistles. It was a sound of release, of a town waking from a long, bad dream. Jonah reached into his coat with his good hand and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. He threw it onto the bar. "That is Harlan Tate's," he said, his voice rough but strong. "Everything is in there. Every penny he extorted, every threat he made. It is all written down in his own hand." He looked around the room. "There is a bounty on my head. I am turning myself in, but I will not be judged by a liar like Jesse. I will be judged by the good people of this town, if there are any left." The bounty was forgotten. The ledger was the real prize. It was proof. It was their own liberation. Jesse, his face a mask of pure hatred, saw his ambition, his power, his entire world crumbling to dust. He was no longer a candidate for sheriff. He was just a drunken, scarred bully who had been humiliated by a girl in a final, desperate act of rage. He drew his pistol. He was not aiming for Jonah. He was aiming for the source of his shame. He was aiming for Clara's back. Jonah saw the movement. He did not have time to think. He threw himself in front of her, a human shield. The gun fired, the sound deafening. Pain, white-hot and sickeningly familiar, exploded in his good shoulder. The impact spun him around, but he did not fall. Fueled by adrenaline and a protective fury, he lunged at Jesse, tackling him to the ground. He brought his fist down once, a single, precise blow, and Jesse went limp, knocked cold for the second time in his life. Jonah staggered to his feet, blood seeping through his shirt, the world tilting around him. Clara rushed to him, her hands fluttering over his new wound, her face a mask of terror and love. "Jonah!" she cried, her voice breaking. He just looked at her, a faint smile on his lips. She threw her arms around his neck, careful of his injuries, and kissed him. She kissed him there in the middle of the saloon, in front of the entire town, with the smell of gunpowder and whiskey in the air. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a fierce, defiant, desperate act of love and freedom, a claim she made in front of everyone, for everyone to see. She was not a prize or a harlot or a thing to be used. She was his, and he was hers, and they were finally, irrevocably, free. Months passed. The brutal winter gave way to a gentle, hopeful spring. The land, which had been locked under a shroud of snow, came alive with the tender green of new grass and the vibrant colors of wildflowers. Redemption, too, began to heal. With Tate's ledgers as evidence, the town was able to clean house, electing Elias Vance as an interim mayor until a proper circuit judge could arrive. Jesse, disgraced and broken, had long since vanished. On the edge of Elias's land, on a small rise overlooking the valley, a new cabin was taking shape. Jonah, his arm now healed, worked from sunup to sundown, the clean, rhythmic sound of his hammer and saw replacing the memory of gunshots. Clara worked alongside him, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and grass. Her hands, once soft from steam and hot water, now strong and calloused. They were building a life, one log at a time. Hanging on a peg inside the half-finished cabin was her old saloon apron. It was stained and worn, a relic of a life she had left behind. She kept it, not as a reminder of her shame, but as proof that she had survived. It was her battle standard, her testament. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, Jonah pressed something into her hand. It was a small, 5-pointed star, carved from a piece of smooth, pale cottonwood. It was not perfect. It was whittled by a man who was more comfortable with a gun than a knife. But it was beautiful. "It is not to mark you," he said softly, his voice full of a meaning that went far beyond the words. "It is to remind you." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "To remind you that you saved yourself," he said. She closed her hand around the small star, its points pressing into her palm. She had faced down the monster and won. She had found her own voice and spoken her own truth. She looked out over the land that almost killed her, and loved it anyway, because now it had a name, and so did she. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below, so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.